Well, good evening and welcome to this much delayed and much anticipated Lord Caradon Lecture for 2020. Our speaker this evening, Kim Darroch, needs, as they say, little introduction. He was the UK's ambassador to Washington, of course, during the majority of the Trump administration. Then almost exactly 2 years ago, he gained entirely unsought celebrity when some of his candid and confidential reports on the nature of that administration found their way into the newspapers. Now, he's since written a book covering that period entitled Collateral Damage: Britain, America and Europe in the Age of Trump, and he now sits in the Lords as a crossbench peer. Over the course of his long and distinguished diplomatic career, he was EU advisor to Tony Blair, UK permanent representative to the European Union under Gordon Brown and David Cameron, and then national security advisor also under David Cameron. Now, had this event taken place as originally planned in November, it would have coincided with the immediate and dramatic aftermath of the US elections. There was understandable disappointment at losing that seemingly perfect window in time. But now, of course, we do have the benefit of being able to look back at the first 5 months of the Biden presidency, which has seen him visit Britain recently to attend the G7, to meet Boris Johnson and EU leaders, and then, of course, off to Geneva to meet Vladimir Putin. Now, we've received a lot of interesting questions, but before we move to the Q&A session, I'd like to invite Lord Darroch to set the scene for us with some introductory remarks. So I invite you all to give a very warm virtual welcome to the Lord Caradon Lecturer for 2020, Lord Darroch.
Martin, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I'm sorry it's taken so long to make this happen. And for those of you in the audience who were signed up for the original event last year and are still in the audience now, thank you for your patience. I admire your dedication. I promised to be brief in my introduction, but when we get to the Q&A session, I'm happy to talk about my other career specialities, Europe and my time as National Security Advisor. But I thought I would kick off with some brief thoughts about politics in the United States. There are obviously many places I could start, but I'll begin with how and why, in my view, Joe Biden won the election. Only 7 months ago, though it feels much longer. I'll say something about him and about how he's doing and the prospects of the rest of his presidency. But having studied the man for 5 years, I can't resist also saying something about Donald Trump and where he might go next. And I'll finish with a few words on UK-US relations. So how and why did Joe Biden win? A lot of analysis has blamed Trump's defeat on his handling of the pandemic, the incompetence, the deliberately misleading messaging, the ridiculing of precautions like mask wearing. All of that certainly led substantial numbers of Americans to believe he wasn't up to the job and was putting his own interests before their health. Incidentally, for any in the audience who wants to know more about Trump and the pandemic, there's a recently published book by a couple of American journalists called Nightmare Scenario: Inside the Trump Administration's Response to the Pandemic, that has some extraordinary, scarcely believable stories about what was going on inside the White House during that period. But in my view, the loss wasn't just down to the pandemic. The reality is that Trump was in trouble well before then. He did badly in the midterm elections, November 2018, the Republicans losing their majority in the House of Representatives. It was already clear by then that groups of voters were turning against him, especially college-educated women. He never got above the low 40s in approval ratings from the US population as a whole, though he never dropped below 80% amongst Republican voters. How did this translate into a Biden win? The Democrat base turned out for Biden in much bigger numbers than for Hillary Clinton. But more importantly, Biden won the center, the independents. In 2016, Hillary Clinton lost independents by 4 points. In 2020, Biden won them by 13 points. And in the end, it was a comfortable victory, though it took forever, as you all remember, for the results to emerge. Biden made gains in 2 parts of America, in the Sun Belt and in the Rust Belt. He won Arizona and Georgia, 2 states which have seen big influxes of younger, more diverse, college-educated voters, as high-tech industries have moved in, and he won 3 so-called Rust Belt states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which are traditionally Democratic, but which gave Trump the election in 2016, and these 3 states came home to the Democrat Party. I personally believe that one of the factors here was a Trump failure to deliver on promises. He told voters that he would bring back the factories which had gone overseas and that he would reopen the coal mines. In reality, neither really happened. Over the past 12 months, more jobs have been lost in the US coal and mining industry than any time in the last 60 years, and nearly 1,800 factories disappeared during the first 2 years of the Trump administration. So it's yet another illustration of a political fact of life. If you overpromise and underdeliver, the voters will notice and they will make you pay. So Biden won, and just to be clear, although there was a lot of media coverage of recounts and legal challenges, there was never any chance of this election outcome being overturned. It took a long time to get there, but Biden actually won quite comfortably. The Electoral College by 306 to 232, and the popular vote by more than 6 million. Indeed, the recounts demanded by the Trump camp mostly turned out to give bigger majorities to Biden. So how is Joe Biden doing? Let's pause for a second on Joe Biden, the man, and his journey to the highest office. He's the son of a used car salesman. He was raised in Scranton, Pennsylvania, a former coal mining and railway town, which, though now somewhat revitalized, once epitomized industrial decline. He was, to be frank, a pretty average student, but he was a natural politician, and he won a seat in the US Senate, aged just 29. His 35-year Senate career was defined by pragmatism. Stubbornly centrist, he consistently built bridges to Republicans to get things done. 2020 was his 3rd run for the presidency, after failures in 1988, when he plagiarized Neil Kinnock's speech, and 2008, when his campaign bid never really left the launch pad. And he suffered more than his fair share of personal tragedy. His first wife and infant daughter killed in a car crash in 1972, his son, Beau Biden, dying of brain cancer in 2015. As president, it's already clear that his style is very different to his predecessor. He is conspicuously trying to govern for all Americans, not just the Democrat base. He's trying to restore the norms around how presidents behave. He's trying to work across the political divide with the moderate wing of the Republican Party. It's clear that domestic policy is his first priority. If you watched Biden campaigning, it was a fascinating exercise in transmitting moderation. It meant that he didn't inspire the progressive left wing of the Democrat Party, but he also, more importantly, didn't frighten the voters. He didn't, if you like, come across as if he were running for president of the Students' Union. But actually, in office, in his early days, he's looking more radical in terms of redistribution of wealth policies. He's had an early and substantial triumph with the passage of a $1.9 trillion economic stimulus bill, which is a genuinely historic piece of wealth distribution, which will benefit not just an America suffering from the economic impact of the pandemic, but the entire global economy. To the extent that it's in the hands of the federal government, he has transformed the US pandemic response, especially with the vaccination program. And his next big idea is astonishingly ambitious or financially foolhardy, depending on your viewpoint. He wants to pass 2 new pieces of legislation, which together amount to spending some $6.5 trillion, give or take $1 trillion or 2. The first part of the package is broadly $1 trillion for infrastructure renewal. And if you have been through JFK Airport recently, or driven on the roads around Washington, DC, you'll agree some infrastructure investment is desperately needed. And on this package, he has lived up to his bipartisan credentials by overseeing a deal with a dozen moderate Republicans. The second part is a much bigger and more controversial package of policies and initiatives, christened Biden's Human Infrastructure Plan, around clean energy, action on climate change, subsidized childcare, expansion of the Medicare health program, education, expanded broadband access, and so on. All progressive priorities loved in the Democrat Party, but largely hated by Republicans. Will he get this through? Not exactly as it now is my guess, but I think he will get some sort of package through. And if you add all of these initiatives together, they amount to something not a million miles away from Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal or Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. In other words, a truly radical and historic package of legislation and policies. Internationally, I think Biden is about a reset, hence the headline, America is back. On specifics, this means restoring US relations with Europe, no more of the US is worse than China, one of President Trump's favorite sayings. It means reaffirming US support for multilateralism and for the post-war international order, which is shorthand for those mostly US designed structures like the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, and the World Trade Organization. And it means reaffirming US support for NATO, and for in particular Article 5, the principle that an attack on one is an attack on all. Also means reversing some Trump decisions. Biden had already taken the US back into the Paris climate change agreement. I think he will also try to take the US back into the Iran nuclear deal, though he must first persuade Iran to return to compliance with the limits on its holdings of enriched uranium. And he will want Iran to stop its ballistic missile development program and to stop its destabilizing activities in the region, in Yemen and Iraq and Lebanon and Syria. What about China? I think Biden is going to stay tough on China. It was already clear in my time in Washington that there is a consensus in the US national security community and close to a consensus in Congress that China is the strategic challenge, the strategic rival for America for the 21st century. So Biden will feel compelled, I think, to challenge China over both its trade practices and its activities in the South China Sea. There is, however, I think one likely difference. I think Joe Biden will try to multilateralize policy towards China. Europe has issues over intellectual property theft, or compulsory technology transfer, or the barriers to foreign ownership of Chinese business. But we also, of course, have flourishing and important trade relations with China. So I think it's quite possible that we may be faced in Europe with some difficult choices over the next few years. Meanwhile, what of Donald Trump? Fascinating though it is to watch Joe Biden's development as president, those of us who lived through the Trump era still find ourselves turning first in our newspapers to speculation about what Trump is thinking rather than about news on what Biden is actually doing. There isn't much to go on since his no-show at the Biden inauguration. Trump has done strikingly little. A few interviews with sympathetic news outlets, a couple of speeches, quite a lot of golf. So it's been for me a kind of weirdly medieval scene. Trump like a king in exile, hidden away in Mar-a-Lago in this gilded mansion, endlessly recycling the fantasy that his defeat was a theft and a conspiracy, and plotting his revenge on those who wronged him, while a succession of lesser figures queue to kiss the ring and seek his favor. But the big question, of course, is whether he intends to run in 2024. The context here is one painful but unavoidable fact. In losing to Joe Biden, Donald Trump got the votes of 74 million Americans, the largest total of any election loser in US history, and 12 million votes more than he got when winning in 2016. Just pause on that. Notwithstanding everything that happened over the last 4 years, the daily chaos and disruption, the mishandling of the pandemic, leading to the death of more than 500,000 Americans, the belittling of America's allies, the surreal moments like the attempt to buy Greenland, and an additional 12 million Americans, beyond those who voted for him, 2016 concluded, I want another 4 years of this. All of which serves as a reminder that there was something genuinely unique and extraordinary about Trump, the politician. However bad he was as president, and I personally think he was a terrible president, he was and is an extraordinarily charismatic figure and an instinctive and gifted populist politician. He continues to mobilize the casualties of globalization and the victims of the 2008 financial crisis. And even if he failed to do much for that constituency during his presidency, it doesn't seem amongst his followers to have significantly dented his popularity. It's as if the message was enough. They didn't actually expect him to deliver on his promises. They still love the show. They still want a second season. All that said, personally, and this is obviously a guess, my money is on Trump not running in 2024 for two reasons. First, I think he will be tied up pretty much daily in court over the next 3 years. There are more than a dozen criminal and civil cases against him lining up. And second, I think he simply won't want to take the risk of losing. A senior member of his campaign team once told me that Trump would rather not run than run and lose, because psychologically he couldn't handle losing. In this context, it's significant that in a recent straw poll amongst Republican voters about who should be the 2024 candidate, Trump came only second, beaten by one Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. As for the Republican Party, I believe most of their senior figures want the party to move on. What's taxing them, however, and the reason why they remain so deferential to a leader whose 4 years in office led to their losing both the Houses of Congress and the White House, is they want to keep the Trump voters, the Trump nation, and they fear rightly that this constituency is more loyal to the man than the party. I'll finish with a few words about UK relations with the new administration. We didn't start in the perfect place. Neither Biden personally nor the Democrats in general are admirers of Brexit, and we risk counting for less in Washington. Now we are no longer sitting around and able to influence the EU table. That said, the Christmas Eve deal with the EU, deeply inadequate though it is in my view, makes a big difference. If it had all ended in acrimony, especially if we had attempted unilaterally to rewrite our withdrawal agreement over the Irish Protocol, I think there could have been a real rift with the US. Remember Biden's Irish ancestry. As it is, however, the US will hope that we have built on the foundations provided by that deal. And we're lucky that 2021 has found us hosting two events bringing Biden to these shores. The G7 summit in Cornwall has just happened, and the COP26 climate change conference in Glasgow in November. I thought the G7 was a qualified success for the government, qualified because it was overshadowed for the government by the row with the EU over Northern Ireland. But it was, I think, for Biden personally, a complete success. And he signalled clearly that he is ready for a productive relationship with the UK and with the Prime Minister, provided we don't do anything crazy over the Northern Ireland Protocol. While we're talking about Cornwall, while I'm in the vicinity of Cornwall, by the way, I might declare my wife and I are part-time residents of the county. I know how much Devonians admire and esteem their Cornish neighbours. The best single aspect of the G7 summit was the amazing Saturday weather, which showed Cornwall at its best, and the decision to invite the head chef of our local beachside restaurant, just a mile or two away from where I am, the Hidden Hut, to cook the Saturday night dinner for the heads of state and prime ministers. If you've not been to the Hidden Hut, you're missing out. Finally, back on UK-US relations, the bedrock is actually the shared history, the cultural ties, but above all, the defence, intelligence, and security ties. As Ambassador to Washington, I saw at close quarters just how strong and deep these are, how little affected they were by the turbulence and disruption at political level. They will, I am sure, remain as strong as ever. Actually, they will flourish under Biden's leadership, which is where I think I should finish, except for the closing advertising slot. Just to let you all know that the paperback version of my book, Collateral Damage, featuring an extra updating chapter, should be in the bookshops in August. It's a great holiday read, lots of jokes. So enjoy it. Thanks, and let's take some comments and questions.
Thank you, Kim. Well, I'd like to expand to begin with, perhaps on the G7. I'm curious, in your view, was there anything surprising or revelatory in terms of what emerged from that series of meetings with Boris Johnson, the EU leaders, and Vladimir Putin?
I'll make 3 points, I think, on this. On the Johnson-Biden meeting, Biden has recruited a very experienced foreign policy team who know Europe well, who most of whom worked for Obama for 4 years or 8 years, and who just know their stuff. And I mean, I've talked to many of them over my time in Washington. I know that they're not great fans of Brexit, but they're pragmatists. And the pragmatic decision is that we still bring a lot to the table, even if we're not members of the European Union. And it's important to them to have a good relationship with us so far as possible. So I think that was reflected in the way Biden handled his meeting with Prime Minister Johnson. All the positive vibes that were coming out of that, and the agreement from Biden to sign effectively a new Atlantic Charter, bringing with it echoes, resonances of Roosevelt and Churchill, which was very nice for Prime Minister Johnson as a Churchill biographer. So all of that was predictable but smart, because if they want to influence us, you need to start from a good starting point, I think. On the G7 more generally, look, it was overshadowed in the British media for reasons I understand, by the row that we have running still a bit, though it's died down recently, with the EU over implementation of the Irish Protocol and what happens to this border down the middle of the Irish Sea. On that, I confess I don't have much sympathy with the British government, British though I am, because when you sign international agreements, it's not like a kind of a la carte menu where you choose the bits you like and ignore the rest. You have to implement all of it. So when I hear government ministers saying that the EU are being too assiduous about implementation and demanding too much and they need more flexibility and all the rest of it, I think that doesn't really add to our credibility, both with the EU in this particular sort of ongoing negotiation and more generally internationally. We have a reputation implementing the treaties that we sign. I think we should stick with that. With Putin, every American president has to tread a tightrope. On the one hand, you've got to look, because there's always issues with any Russian administration, any Russian government, but it's particularly bad with Putin after what he's done in recent years with the invasion of Ukraine, the taking over of Crimea, what he did in Syria. There's a whole long crime list that has to be raised with him, and Biden had to be tough with him. But the world also thinks it's important that there is a working relationship and an active channel between the President of the United States and the guy in the Kremlin, and between the two administrations. So it mustn't be so bad that you stop talking. So you've got to strike a balance. And I thought Biden was experienced. He was he's a kind of foreign policy geek. I mean, he was head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for many years. I think he struck the balance about right. But going forward, that will be the test, whether Putin thinks he can take some liberties and do some more bad things, or whether, contrast, he can work with the US administration, with the Biden administration, to do some deals, of which the obvious first step would be one on those all now expired nuclear weapon agreements that we had in the 80s and 90s. So negotiations on a new START treaty or something like that, I think, are an obvious starting place. So overall, Biden did pretty well on his first big overseas trip. And for the UK, for the British government, G7 was a qualified success. They would have been a bit disappointed with the media coverage, I think.
you're right, clearly that the row of the Irish protocol is dominating domestic politics alongside COVID. Looking at the history of it, and I think you've hinted your view of the process which got us to where we are, but it was a solution, if it is a solution, initially flatly rejected, whereby you would create a border down the Irish Sea. A few weeks ago, Lord Frost, the EU, the British chief negotiator, said the government had been surprised at how difficult things have proved, and indeed says that the EU is being too purist in its approach. But even if you take the view that, you know, we've agreed to this thing, the rules are clear, it's equally clear, isn't it, that implementing the rules in that way will cause an ongoing political problem, and it'll get worse as this grace period in terms of border inspections ends.
Martin, you have identified with perfect accuracy the problem facing the British government now. And it's a problem they're in creation. Remember that whatever one thought about the Theresa May administration, they thought about the option of putting the border down the Irish Sea and rejected it because they thought it would destabilize the situation in Northern Ireland. And by the way, there is no excuse for saying you're surprised by what has happened, because everyone who knew anything about Northern Ireland predicted this. You know, a good friend of mine, Jonathan Powell, who worked for Tony Blair and negotiated much of that agreement, was pretty much every channel going, saying this was very dangerous and very risky. So, you know, there's no excuse for saying it's a surprise, and there's no excuse, in my view, for saying that the EU are being too purist, because, you know, this is you know, you have to implement the whole thing. If you sign up to it, you know, every article in it is something that needs to be implemented. You can't pick and choose. There is a way through, I think, but it involves the government being less purist itself about sovereignty issues. The EU has offered a food safety or a veterinary agreement to be negotiated, which would solve a lot of the problems over British food and drink exports going into Northern Ireland from mainland, from the UK. The government has so far been rejecting that because they think that if you signed up to that, we would have to follow EU standards, which means it would be more difficult to do future trade deals with countries like America. But I'm not sure there's really much of a political market for lowering our food standards in order to import chlorine-washed chicken or hormone-treated beef, honestly. So I just don't think, if you look on the one hand, the damage and the risks for the Good Friday Agreement with Northern Ireland settlement, on the other hand, having to follow EU food safety rules and maintain our food safety standards, I think it's a no-brainer, but you know, that's where I come from on this.
And just before we leave Brexit, in terms of the trade deals, we've got the broad bones of the Australian trade deal. Great concern from farmers about potential lowering of standards, you know, they're then becoming uncompetitive. The government is insistent that there will be checks and balances and safeguards. And of course, they're looking ahead to the American deal as the big one, and what precedent this might set. What would your view be on that? Well,
I think that, first of all, Australia is precisely a forerunner for a UK-US deal, which would be much more of a threat to the British agriculture industry, much more of a threat to the British agriculture industry. So I'm not surprised that the farming community have got upset about worried about the EU-Australia deal, UK-Australia deal, but there's a lot more to come, because its impact on our GDP, as most calculations, is minimal. The UK-US deal has much more impact. So that's coming down the track when the Biden administration are ready to negotiate it. Second point, when the government talk about safeguards, I'm not quite sure, I'm not in the government, I'm not quite sure what they mean, but I think they probably mean something around labeling. So it'll say somewhere on your packet of chicken, if it comes from America, that it was washed in chlorine. It'll say something about the beef and all the rest of it. And they will say then the consumer can make a choice between this low price, much lower than the UK product, US agricultural produce, or something that is homegrown. And you know, as a free trader, I can see the argument of that, but I just wonder if consumers will be, how many consumers will read the fine print on the labels and will say they want that because of how it was treated. I mean, I lived in America for 3.5 years. I must have eaten a lot of chlorine washed chicken, hormone GB, and I still think I'm okay. So I don't think there's a real health hazard to these things, but they are very controversial politically in the UK, and a lot of people don't like the idea.
Now, an obvious question to a former ambassador to the United States, and we've had this in various forms, and that's an assessment of the fabled special relationship. There's always the suspicion, I suppose, that it's rather sort of exaggerated in some British imaginations. And I suppose if we look at some famously close personal relationships between British prime ministers and American presidents, whether it's Roosevelt and Churchill or Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, the reality is that they're pretty hard-edged from the American side. Somebody says, is the special relationship really anything more than Five Eyes and Trident missiles?
Yeah. First of all, I don't agree with Prime Minister Johnson on everything, but I rather sympathise with his view on the term, the special relationship, if overused, sounding a bit needy and a little bit precious. And so, I mean, I didn't run away from it when I was in Washington, but I didn't overuse it. And I think it shouldn't be overused because it does sound a bit needy if you keep on banging on about it. Second, of course, the defence, security, and intelligence relationship is a hugely important part of the US-UK relationship, and it's at a political and government-to-government level, it is the bedrock, the main bedrock. But it's not just about that. There are extraordinary cultural ties, a huge amount of shared history, huge amount of shared endeavour, particularly in the century that has just passed with the two world wars, and a lot of mutual admiration and sympathy between the two countries. So it is special, but let's not bang on about it. Now, on its future, I'm sure that the security, defence, and intelligence relationship is as strong as ever, if not stronger. And as we invest a bit more in defence, which is one of the Johnson decisions I support, then I think it will go from strength to strength. I think we have lost something by not being around the table in Brussels, in the European Union. When I was there as British permanent representative, you sit around a table 3 days a week, negotiating on directives and foreign policy decisions and so on. The Americans would often come to us to see if we could help deliver, influence the EU to deliver certain outcomes, whether on bits of legislation which affected America or on foreign policy positions, sanctions on Russia, sanctions on Iran or Iraq, whatever. And we're not around that table anymore. So that particular channel, that wire that was running from Washington to London, that factor that made us count in Washington is gone, which means we have to work all the harder on the other things that matter in the relationship. But we're still permanent members of the Security Council. We still have the Commonwealth. We are still the second biggest contributors to NATO, and I think the fifth biggest military power in the world, fifth or sixth. So we bring a lot to the table, but the Americans will expect us to use all of those instruments in support of their objectives in the future. So there'll be some big asks and tough decisions.
How important are interpersonal relations between leaders? At the G7, we've seen all the smiles and the backslapping, but and in Trump's case, I mean, he very publicly took trenchant and undiplomatic views of individuals. That's very unusual. But behind the scenes, how important can those things be?
Oh, they can be very important, but it's not ever the whole story. Even in the days of Thatcher and Reagan, Macmillan and Kennedy, Blair and Bush, even in those days, it's not the only thing. And you're absolutely right, particularly since they never really hit it off in the days of Trump and May. The relationship was quite difficult at times. And as you'll remember, Trump made some very unflattering remarks about the Prime Minister at various points during her Prime Ministership. And she had to say some tough things to him about some of the things that he had said and done. So it was a fairly turbulent period. But I can promise you that beneath it, and I was sitting in Washington while all this was going on defense and contacts between the intelligence agencies, contacts between the relationship between the security agencies, it was as strong, if not stronger than ever. And there was a huge amount of traffic going in both directions. So all of that was still important, still made us count in Washington, still made a difference. So it's always better for any ambassador in Washington if the two leaders have really hit it off, have a really close relationship, are on the phone to each other every few weeks, and they consult each other in the way, for example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, J.F. Kennedy was consulting Harold Macmillan, or Reagan consulting Thatcher, although Reagan also did things Thatcher didn't like. The Grenada invasion is this example. It's always better if that level of interactions going on heads of government. But if it isn't, the relationship is still unique and very strong.
Now, you've talked about whether Trump might stand again, how strong the loyalty to Trump the man is. I guess it's interesting to speculate whether there can be Trumpism without Trump. But again, as you say, there was an enormous vote for Trump at the last election. Are we seeing a permanent change in US politics, do you think? It's not, clearly can't be the case. That's all just been put in a box and it's business as usual. And what does that mean, even without Trump himself, for the Republican Party and for US politics moving forward?
Martin, we used to get asked this question during the era of Trump, not quite every week, but a lot by ministers and by Whitehall. And I mean, the short answer is, but it's a cop-out answer, is it's too soon to tell. I personally never thought that there was really a sort of tectonic shift in American politics and in America's external posture as signified by Trump. And I thought that if you got a Biden in or a mainstream Republican, particularly if you got a Democrat in, you get a reset which made things look normal, back to traditional American foreign policy quite quickly. But I think by 2024, if the needle goes back to the other side of the dial and Trump does run and does win, or more likely, someone who is a Trump product, who advocates the same sort of positions and policies, but perhaps does it all rather better than Trump did and runs the government more competently, then maybe we'll have to say that actually there has been a fundamental shift in America's view of the world and in America's wish to engage with the rest of the world. There's a little passage in, sorry to mention the book, there's a little passage in the book about when some senior American officials, including Richard Holbrooke and Tony Lake, came across to London in the mid-90s and announced that they were going to sort out Bosnia because you Europeans have failed to do it. And they were going to have a peace conference and they were just going to sort out. And they did with the Dayton Peace Agreement. I think it was very touch and go, but they did it. And that was America acting as the superpower, trying to make the world a better place, trying to stop injustice, the ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, and trying to solve global problems. Donald Trump really wasn't interested in any of that. I mean, he didn't think it was America's role to go out and sort out small wars anywhere. He wanted to get the American troops back from Afghanistan and from Iraq and from Syria and anywhere else they were. Biden is much more cautious than some of his predecessors because I think he senses that the national mood in America has changed on external interventions like that because after all that time in Afghanistan, 20 years, I think when we leave, there's a real risk the Taliban will be back in Kabul within a couple of years. So globally, the whole appetite for interventions like Afghanistan and Iraq has gone, and Biden is reflecting that. But is America going to withdraw further, not even try to sort of broker deals and sort out international problems and use its political, economic, and military weight? I don't know. I think that I personally tilt toward the optimistic side. to think America is back and that this Biden reset will last, but I wouldn't want to bet my house on it.
But the Republican Party clearly has gone through this enormous convulsion. You've got previous Republican presidents saying that Trump was unfit for office. We've had one question was curiosity, which you might shed some light on as to why some, if you like, conventional, or one might say more moderate Republicans had agreed to take part in the Trump administration. But as I say, that there has been a reset of the Republican Party. It's difficult to see that moving backwards very quickly, isn't it?
Yeah. Some of the moderate Republicans who served in the Trump administration would tell you that they believed that they were protecting America by doing so, that this was an inconsistent and willful president whose actions needed to be controlled and moderated, and that's why they were there. People like Jim Mattis, who was one of the most decorated of US generals, and then the Secretary of Defense for 2.5 years until Trump sacked him, and he was a deeply honorable and moderate man. And there were others who would say that that's what they were basically doing. The Republican Party now look to me, a Republican would get angry if I said hearing this, it's in a huge mess and deeply, deeply divided. There are those, I think they're in the majority at the moment, but we haven't had polls which say that, who think that the Republican Party cannot win elections unless it maintains the support of the Trump nation, the Trump base. But without those voters, then they are going to lose in the midterms in 2022 and in the next election, 2024. And there are those, on the other side, there are some quite prominent figures there, by the way, including Liz Cheney, who is Dick Cheney's daughter and who was number 3 Republican in the House of Representatives before she got fired because she wanted to impeach Trump over the Capitol invasion. So there's some big figures on the other side, but there are those who think the party has got to move forward, has got to try and make itself more attractive to minorities in America who, one of the key statistics here is that I think it's by 2035, the white population of America will be less than 50% of the whole population. So it'll be the biggest group still, but it won't be the majority. And therefore, the argument that these Republicans are saying is you have to be more appealing to all the other communities, ethnic communities in America, if you want to win future elections. I don't know how it'll come out. At the moment, it looks like a sort of a faction, the side of the Republican Party, who think they have to hang on to the Trump voters, even if that means making some very unpleasant compromises, are dominant. But whether they will still be there in 2023, 2024, depends a lot on what happens to Donald Trump, meanwhile, over the next 2 or 3 years. So it's all to play for. But at the moment, if you had to put a bet down, you would have to say that it's more likely that a Trumpist candidate will run for the Republicans in 2024 than a mainstream Republican.
Trump has gone, but if we move to this side of the Atlantic, I mean, you have drawn some parallels between the Trump phenomenon and Brexit, which obviously ultimately brought about the Johnson administration, but it's a huge 80-seat majority. The opinion polls here pretty consistently excellent for Boris Johnson's administration. There seems to be no real dent in that. What was your estimation of whether or not there's a permanent reset on this side of the Atlantic as well? Are we looking at one of these sort of great epochs, like the post-war consensus, or the way in which the Thatcher legacy essentially continued to filter down through politics, well, until I suppose the European referendum?
Yeah, that's a really good and challenging question, Martin. And I mean, the short answer is, I'm not certain, but I do think that it is extraordinary to see those elections a couple of months ago, sort of our midterm elections. I think 2019, you can say there was a very weak lead of the Labour Party, and people were still voting basically about Brexit, and all the pro-Brexit votes went to Conservatives. Anti-Brexit votes were split between about 3 or 4 parties. And so you can make various excuses for what happened. You know, the elections a few weeks ago, that extraordinary victory in Hartlepool, and further evidence that the northern red wall has been dismantled and has become a kind of conservative stronghold. I mean, it does feel as if the Conservatives now have a completely different, or largely different, base of support from the one that they had in previous decades. A view that is amplified by them losing Amersham, which is not very far from where I live in London. And if you just drive around that part of Buckinghamshire, the idea that it wouldn't vote Conservative, it's just extraordinary. So I do wonder if something quite extraordinary and fundamental is happening in British politics in some terms of some sort of realignment of the voting divide, with Labour becoming no longer the party of the traditional Northern and Midlands working classes, unionised working classes, becoming the party of the sort of metropolitan, calling them the elite is unfair, but people working in cities who are college educated, which is all a bit like where the Democrats now are, where the Democrats' stronghold in America is in the big urban areas amongst the college educated. The more educated you are, the more likely you are to vote Democrat in America. So I wonder if there's something extraordinary happening here, or whether when we come to the next British general election, we'll see the whole thing tilt back to a much more traditional division. But I mean, as I saw those results come in a few weeks ago, I was just completely astonished and thinking to myself, I've been away from this country too long. I just don't quite understand what's happening anymore. Political editor, maybe you can explain it to me.
Boris Johnson, to say, looks pretty impregnable at the moment. You mentioned that the Chesham and Amersham by-election. I guess so far the realignment looks entirely to be in Boris Johnson's favour. The question, I suppose, is whether he ends up trying to stretch the elastic too far.
There's one other factor here, Martin, which I noticed in America very, very visibly. I think it's happening here as well. I don't know whether it's because of the internet and because of social media or whatever, but people's, and this is not a derogatory comment, it's just a sort of what my perception, attention spans seem to have shortened. When Trump did something just indefensible in America, which he did several times, his polls would dip sharply for about 3 weeks, and they'd climb back up again to where they were. When the pandemic, the response to them was going very badly for the government, you saw Johnson's personal ratings falling below Keir Starmer's, and the ratings of the party falling as well. And there was a lot of unrest on the Conservative backbenchers about the opinion poll readings. You get a successful vaccination program, and it jumps up again. And he has an extraordinary result in those elections a few weeks ago, and looks, as you say, impregnable. And I still think he is in an extraordinarily strong position to win an election 2022 or 2024. But the polls bounce around an awful lot according to what has happened that week. And Harold Wilson, nobody actually ever said it, week a long time in politics. Who knows what can happen in the next couple of years that can change the equation dramatically. Who knows what, I mean, if you had Andy Burnham or even a David Miliband as leader of the Labour Party, what the figures look like then? How much is it personality driven? these are all questions bouncing around in my head. Don't know the answers, but all I can do at the moment is watch and try to understand and think how much politics seems to have changed in the UK since, because I was here away for all of the Brexit campaign, how much it seems to have changed in the last 5 years.
You do talk about the use of social media in your book, and say something along the lines of, he who can use social media is king. I mean, Trump did have the most extraordinary manner of saying all manner of frank things on social media, having that direct contact with the electorate. Biden, as far as I'm aware, is far, far removed from that kind of thing. But how important does that kind of engagement through social media remain, in your view?
Yeah, I think it was hugely important for Donald Trump because, I mean, Trump believed the mainstream media were against him, and honestly, I think he had a point. I think they did conclude early on that he wasn't the sort of character who should be president. So he did have a very rough time from the mainstream media, but he was a master of the tweet, and he basically governed by tweet. It enabled him, by the way, to comment like anyone on Twitter might on things that were nothing to do with being in government. The result of the Super Bowl, Arnold Schwarzenegger's terrible ratings as on The Apprentice, whatever took his fancy, the Oscars, this kind of stuff. So he was like not a president, just more of a sort of daily commentator on what was going on. And his readership, his followers, millions and millions of them, loved it. And one of the factors I think that will really hold him back for 2024 bid, and the reason why people like DeSantis now seem to be potentially more popular in years, is he is silenced on social media. And he hasn't really developed an alternative. He still does his rallies, did one the other day, with a big and very enthusiastic audience, but that's not the same as reaching 50 million followers with a single tweet. So Trump was a master of social media, and he's really missing it now he's been banned from it. Biden, however, is getting much higher approval ratings consistently, 60% plus, than Trump ever did for the American population as a whole, even though he's not using social media. So what I'm saying is I don't think it's essential for any politician nowadays to be a master of social media. There are other ways of doing it, more conventional ways of getting people to approve of, to like what you're doing. And I don't think, honestly, Boris Johnson uses social media that much, certainly not in a very sort of, occasionally you get the odd tweet from him which causes a bit of a storm, but it's not really anything like the kind of thing that Donald Trump would do. So the jury's out on whether social media is an essential tool for the modern politician or not.
And a personal question, somebody's interested in whether or not the investigation as to the identity of the person who leaked your reports proceeded anywhere, and what would you say to this individual if you met them over dinner?
Has it led anywhere? I don't think. I know it hasn't led to anyone being charged, let alone convicted. I think the police did the investigation, as was in the media. At one point, they arrested someone and held them for 48 hours, but then released them. I don't know whether it's yet reached that category which TV shows love so much of the cold case, but I suspect it has. But I mean, there it is. It's feels a long time ago for me now. So it's not something I think about very much. However, if I met them for dinner, I would just be fascinated to know what the motive was. Was it that they thought that I was being unfair to Donald Trump? Was it just they thought the stuff was interesting and deserved a wider audience? Thanks very much. Was there some financial gain involved? I don't know. I'd just like to know why they did it and whether they had expected to have it to have the effect that it did, in other words, leading to my resignation. But it wouldn't be, I wouldn't feel like sort of getting angry with the person, because it's all history now.
And what's the future for Kim Darroch? You're sitting in the Lords, as I said. You've got vast expertise in terms of the US, knowledge of the EU, foreign relations generally. Which causes are you likely to be pursuing?
Well, I have done my maiden speech and a couple of other speeches in the Lords, and I write an occasional piece in the newspapers. I think that the thing that I'm most exercised at the moment about is back on Brexit. I'm not trying to reopen Brexit or reverse the decision that the British people by a narrow majority took back in 2016. But I do think that the deal that was done on Christmas Eve was not a good deal. It was a bad deal. And I think in pursuit of perfect sovereignty, which is an illusion, we have damaged ourselves significantly in terms of our economy and our trade relations with Europe. And I think Brexit isn't done. Indeed, Lord Frost and my old friend Maros Sefcovic, who when I was in Brussels was the Slovakian ambassador to the EU, used to sit next to me, and he's now Vice President of the European Union, so he's done much better than I have. Anyway, he is David Frost, Lord Frost's negotiating partner, and those negotiations are going to run and run and run. The idea that Brexit is done is a fantasy, because there are so many aspects of that deal that need to be improved. Otherwise, we'll have no shellfish industry. Our fishermen are furious, as is well known down in the southwest, about the way things are panning out. There are all sorts of non-tariff barriers to trade, and we have to sort them out. And sorting them out, I think, involves some compromises on sovereignty, but it's essential for the greater economic good of the country. So that's the thing I feel most strongly about at the moment. Alongside Britain, global Britain, as the government likes to call it, playing a responsible and effective role internationally, even though we now left the EU, living up to our commitments, living up to our treaties and our agreements, and behaving like the UK should. So that's what I care about and what I will be, when the opportunity comes out, I'll speak about. Otherwise, I spend some time down in Cornwall, which is very nice. Thank you very much, and I will come down here a lot. And I hope people won't groan when they hear this, but there is something I'd quite like to write about earlier bits of my career, about being National Security Advisor, about my time doing the EU, about my time doing Bosnia and Kosovo in the 90s, and other aspects of my career. So when I can get my act together, I might write a volume 2.
We look forward to that. Kim Darroch, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much.
Kim, thank you very much indeed for a new venture for us, which is the conversation format rather than the formal lecture. Most of our customers very much enjoy the wine and canapé afterwards, so we're hoping to return to that format in the autumn. But can I first of all say to you, thank you very much for submitting yourself to this. It's taken a while. Thank you very much for your patience. And to say it's a tour de force is a bit of an understatement. I mean, anything of this sort that has shellfish and strategic arms reduction in the same conversation, I think says legions for what you've said to us. You will receive in due course a memento of this event in the form of a Dartington glass bowl once we can get it to you.
Thank you very much.
Also, the RNLI will receive a cheque for £300 from the trustees of the trust.
Well, I'll be taking my boat out in the next week or two down in Cornwall, so I hope I don't need to call on them, but if I do, I'll say I'll just give you 300 quid.
And can I also pay particular thanks to Catherine Patrick of Collins, who, invisible to everybody, has been incredibly patient and incredibly helpful all the way through. Can I thank Martin for hosting? That was a great performance. Thank you very much indeed, and all the preparation you put into it. Can I thank Plymouth Marjon for hosting the event so capably and for their patience as well, and particularly to Helen Thewlis, who has behind the scenes managed all this for the enjoyment of our patrons. We also should thank the audience because they've been very patient and shown great forbearance. They've also shown great generosity in the last 12 months in donating money to keep this little charity going. So thank you very much indeed. We raised about £4,000, which is going to give the charity a lease of life running out into the distant future. So thank you very much. And I guess it would be remiss of me at this point not to flag up our next speaker, which will be at 7:30 on the 27th of October, hopefully at Plymouth University. Professor Kerry Brown. He's the director of the Lao China Institute and the professor of Chinese Studies at King's College London. So that's something for us all to look forward to, and hopefully it will be in the customary format. So, Kim, thank you very much indeed. Martin,
thank you very much, Simon.
Indeed. And good night.
Thanks. Good night.